The insistent ringing of the cell phone echoed through the room once again. Rebecca Harrison watched the familiar name flash across the screen with a mixture of anger and determination. James Crawford, her ex-husband, was trying to contact her for the 12th time that week. With a quick and already automatic movement, she slid her finger to reject the call, adding another brick to the wall of silence she had built between them. Autumn in Ann Arbor painted the streets in golden hues, but Rebecca barely noticed the beauty of the season through the windows of her new apartment downtown. At 42, she was finally starting to rebuild her life after 15 years of a marriage that had deteriorated like paper exposed to acid rain. "You can't ignore me forever," Beck said, the voice message that she deleted without fully listening to it. The affectionate nickname he still insisted on using sounded like a discordant note in her ears. Rebecca adjusted the collar of her white blouse, trying to ignore the persistent cough that had accompanied her for a few weeks. At Michigan Chemical Solutions, the company they had both built together, and which she had left after the divorce, the stories about James' erratic behavior over the last few months were flying around. Miranda Phillips, his former assistant, and the only person he still had contact with from the company, reported that he spent hours locked in his office, surrounded by piles of old documents and laboratory results. "He's obsessive," Rebecca Miranda had said during their last breakfast together at Zingerman's Deli. "Something about old safety records and chemical exposure. James barely sleeps, barely eats. I've never seen him like this." Rebecca dismissed the concern with a wave of her hand. She knew her ex-husband's manipulative games all too well. For years, he had been a master at creating drama to keep her under his thumb, using the company as an excuse to monopolize her time and attention. The joint pains began subtly as little reminders that her 40s were no longer so gentle. Dr. Marcus Bennett, her new doctor, attributed the symptoms to the stress of the divorce and the sudden change in routine. "Your body is processing the changes," he said with a reassuring smile. "Give it time." But time seemed to run differently since he had left Michigan Chemical Solutions. Nights were punctuated by increasingly frequent coughs, and unexplained spots began to appear on her skin. Rebecca attributed it all to stress, anxiety, and sleepless nights, thinking about how she had wasted so many years with someone who in the end had turned out to be a stranger. In the corridor of the building where she now lived, her neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, a nice retired teacher, stopped to chat. "Darling, you don't look well. Perhaps you should see another doctor." The genuine concern in her voice made Rebecca hesitate for a moment, but she held her ground. "I'm fine, Mrs. Walsh. I just need to adjust to my new life." James' calls became more frequent and desperate. Emails began to arrive with increasingly alarming subject lines. "Urgent, I need to talk about your health. Please, Beck, it's a life or death matter." Every attempt to contact them was methodically blocked. New numbers were added to the block list. Emails were marked as spam. Letters were returned unopened. Rebecca built her fortress of silence with the precision of an architect determined not to let him find any loopholes. In her new office at the University of Michigan Library, where she had secured a position as technical collection coordinator, Rebecca began to organize her new routine. The beige walls and endless bookshelves offered a different kind of comfort from the industrial environment she was used to. There, between the yellowed pages and the comforting silence, she tried to ignore the signals her body was sending her. One afternoon, while cataloging a new batch of publications on industrial chemistry and irony that didn't go unnoticed, Rebecca came across an article on prolonged exposure to industrial solvents. The symptoms described seemed to mirror her own recent experiences, but she closed the magazine, tightly refusing to let James' paranoia infect her new life. Miranda continued to bring worrying news about James' mental state. "He's talking about lawsuits, corporate responsibility, medical treatments." "Rebecca, maybe you should—" "No," Rebecca interrupted her firmly. "I don't want to know. Whatever it is, it's just another one of his tactics." The weeks turned into months, and the siege of silence remained impenetrable. Rebecca looked at herself in the mirror every morning, noticing the subtle but undeniable changes in her body, the growing tiredness, the pallor that wouldn't go away, the small tremors in her hands that made it increasingly difficult to hold her morning cup of coffee. On a particularly difficult morning, when the cold Michigan air seemed to tear at her lungs with every breath, Rebecca found a letter slid under her door. James' familiar handwriting trembled on the envelope, But this time, there was something different. Tear stains smeared his name across the paper. For a moment his hand hesitated over the envelope, but the memory of all the past manipulations strengthened his resolve. The envelope met its fate in the garbage can along with all the other attempts to contact her. What Rebecca didn't know was that the letter would be her last. In her silent apartment protected by walls of hurt and mistrust, she couldn't have imagined that her ex-husband was carrying a secret that could change or save her life. Time, that implacable judge, continued its course indifferent to the human dramas unfolding under its eternal gaze, while a terrible truth awaited the right moment to come to light. The news of James Crawford's death arrived on a gray Wednesday via a phone call from Miranda. Rebecca was organizing reports in the library when her cell phone vibrated, displaying her former colleague's name. For a moment she considered ignoring the call, but something about the frequency of the vibrations made her answer. "Rebecca James?" Miranda could barely form the words between sobs. "He was found at his office this morning. The doctor said it was a heart attack." The world seemed to freeze. Rebecca sat down heavily in her chair, feeling the weight of that information pressing down on her chest like an anvil. The last few weeks of ignored calls and deleted emails flashed through her mind like a slow-motion movie. "There's something else," Miranda continued, her voice shaking. "He left specific instructions for your lawyer, Gregory Palmer. You need to be present at the reading of the will, which will take place right after the funeral." The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements and whispers in the corridors of Michigan Chemical Solutions. Rebecca attended the wake more out of obligation than choice, keeping her distance from the closed coffin where the man she had once known so well lay, or so she thought. The funeral took place at the Methodist Church in Ann Arbor, a Gothic building that seemed appropriately somber for the occasion. Rebecca observed those present, mainly current and former employees of the company, some of whom she hadn't seen for months. She noticed that several of them looked ill, with symptoms similar to her own: persistent cough, spots on their skin, occasional tremors. After the ceremony, a select group went to the Palmer & Associates law firm located in an Art Deco building in the city center. The conference room had a solemn air with dark wood paneling and an oval table that looked like it had witnessed decades of corporate secrets. Gregory Palmer, a middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses and a serious expression, wasted no time with preliminaries. "What I'm about to reveal," he began, "goes beyond a simple will. James Crawford has spent the last few months compiling evidence about a serious safety problem at Michigan Chemical Solutions." Rebecca felt her stomach turn as Palmer began to present documents, graphs, and laboratory results. James had discovered that one of the company's main industrial cleaning products, developed at the beginning of their partnership, contained a highly toxic chemical compound, which with prolonged exposure could cause severe damage to the nervous and respiratory systems. James discovered this about 6 months ago. Palmer continued, his eyes fixed on Rebecca. "He tried desperately to get in touch with you, Rebecca, because you were one of the people with the longest exposure to the product." The room began to spin. The joint pains, the persistent cough, the tremors, everything began to make terrible sense. Miranda, sitting next to him, held his hand tightly as silent tears streamed down her face. "There's more," Palmer continued, his voice now softer. "James documented similar cases among dozens of employees, both current and former. He was preparing a massive lawsuit against the suppliers of the chemical components who apparently falsified safety data." Rebecca could hardly breathe. Every attempt to contact her, ignored, every message deleted, every letter thrown away, they all contained a truth that could have changed everything. James wasn't trying to manipulate her, he was trying to save her. "He left everything prepared," explained Palmer, gesturing to the piles of documents on the table. "A substantial fund to cover medical treatment, a complete list of all potentially affected employees, and enough evidence to ensure that those responsible are held accountable." The implications were overwhelming. Rebecca thought of all the employees who had passed through the company over the years. How many lives could have been affected without anyone knowing? Her own body seemed to be screaming the truth that she had refused to hear. "James died fighting to expose this," Palmer concluded, her voice heavy with emotion. "His last act was to ensure that all of you had a chance of treatment and justice." When the meeting ended, Rebecca remained seated, unable to move. The afternoon sun streamed through the high office windows, creating geometric patterns on the carpet. She thought of all the mornings she had woken up feeling increasingly ill, attributing her symptoms to stress and post-divorce depression. Miranda approached, gently placing on the table the last letter James had tried to deliver, the same one Rebecca had thrown away without opening. "He gave me a copy," she said softly. "I think you should read it now." With trembling hands, Rebecca opened the envelope, finding inside not only a letter, but also test results and a detailed list of medical specialists. James' handwriting, normally so firm and precise, showed clear signs of deterioration. "Dear Beck," the letter began, "by the time you read this, it will probably be too late for me." But it can't be too late for you. In the days following the revelation in Palmer's office, Rebecca was plunged into a whirlwind of emotions and actions. The diagnosis came quickly: chronic exposure to organophosphate compounds with significant damage to the nervous system. Dr. Patricia Whalen, a toxicology specialist at the University of Michigan Hospital, didn't hide her concern when examining the results. "If we had discovered this 6 months ago," she said, adjusting her glasses as she studied the CT scans, "we would have much more effective treatment options." Rebecca watched the scans in silence, each image a testament to her stubbornness. The dark spots on her lungs, the subtle changes in her nerve tissue, everything could have been different if she had simply taken one of James' calls. Miranda became her anchor during this period, helping to organize the mountain of documentation that James had left behind. One Sunday afternoon, while going through files in Rebecca's apartment, they found something disturbing: records of customer complaints that had been systematically ignored over the years. "Look at this," said Miranda, holding out a yellowed folder. "Reports from 2015 about employees of a client company in Detroit. They all showed similar symptoms after using our products regularly." The investigation spread like a virus. Gregory Palmer was now coordinating a team of lawyers specializing in class actions, and the number of potential victims was growing daily. The story began to attract local media attention, with the Detroit Free Press publishing a series of investigative reports. Rebecca found strength in an unexpected place: a support group formed by former employees of Michigan Chemical Solutions. Meetings were held on Tuesdays in the basement of the Ann Arbor Baptist Church, where plastic chairs formed a circle under flickering fluorescent lights. It was during one of these meetings that he met Carl Whitaker, a former production supervisor who had worked for the company for 2 decades. "I thought I was going mad," he shared, his hands visibly shaking. "The doctor said it was anxiety, stress, age." Nobody connected the dots. The guilt Rebecca carried was a constant weight. As co-owner of the company, she should have been more vigilant, should have questioned more, investigated more. Nights were filled with nightmares where James tried to reach her through thick glass, his screams silenced by the barrier she herself had created. Palmer's office was transformed into an operations center. Specialists in industrial chemistry were hired to analyze old samples of the products, and the results were increasingly alarming. Not only was the toxic compound present in higher concentrations than permitted, but its interaction with other elements created even more dangerous byproducts. "James documented everything meticulously," explained Palmer during a strategy meeting. "He spent his last months tracking down every batch produced, every customer affected. It was a race against time. The irony escaped no one while James was racing against death to expose the truth. Rebecca was building higher and higher walls to keep him out. The price of this choice was now revealed in each new symptom, each new diagnosis. Dr. Whalen developed a personalized treatment protocol, combining conventional therapies with experimental approaches. "We can't reverse all the damage," she explained, "but we can try to slow down the progression and improve your quality of life." In the midst of the chaos, Rebecca found a purpose. Using her position as a former owner and victim, she became an unofficial spokesperson for the group of those affected. Her media appearances, although painful, helped bring national attention to the case. "It's not just about us," she declared during an interview for WXYZ Detroit. "It's about every person who used these products without knowing the risks, about every family that may be facing consequences that haven't even begun to manifest themselves." The investigation revealed that the suppliers of the chemical components had been falsifying safety data for years, of practice that extended to several other companies in the sector. The Michigan Chemical Solutions case was becoming a catalyst for a complete overhaul of safety protocols in the chemical industry. One particularly difficult afternoon, after a particularly exhausting treatment session, Rebecca asked Miranda to take her to the cemetery. In front of James' grave, she finally allowed the tears to flow freely. "You tried to warn me in every possible way," she whispered, touching the cold headstone, "and I was so determined not to listen that I didn't realize you were trying to save me." Miranda put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He never gave up on you, Beck. Right to the end, he fought to do the right thing." The class action continued to grow, with new cases appearing daily. Palmer estimated that the total number of people affected could run into thousands, considering how widely the products had been distributed over the years. Rebecca learned to live with her new physical limitations, adapting her routine to her treatment needs. Each day brought new challenges, but also small victories: a less intense tremor, a more restful nights, sleep, a moment of clarity amidst the haze of medication. James' legacy, although tragic, was provoking significant changes in the industry. Stricter regulations were being proposed, and other companies were beginning to voluntarily review their quality control processes. The truth, like a corrosive chemical, had finally found its way through the barriers Rebecca had built, leaving permanent scars on her life. But from those scars was born a fierce determination to ensure that history did not repeat itself, that no other person had to learn the hard way that sometimes silence can be more toxic than any chemical. The class action against Michigan Chemical Solutions took on unexpected proportions when Rebecca decided to publicly share her full story in an exclusive interview with the Detroit News. Sitting in her apartment, still fighting the tremors in her hands, she revealed to journalist Marcus Chun the painful details of how her mistrust almost cost not only her own life, but potentially that of hundreds of others. "What haunts me most," Rebecca said, her voice breaking, "is not just the physical symptoms, but the knowledge that James died carrying this weight alone, desperately trying to save us while I kept him outside." The publication of the story triggered an avalanche of new cases. Palmer and Associates had to hire an additional team just to process the hundreds of calls that came in daily. Former employees, clients, and even people who had only visited the company's facilities began to connect their unexplained health problems with exposure to the chemicals. On one particularly difficult morning, while Rebecca was waiting for her treatment session at the University of Michigan Hospital, a woman approached her chair in the waiting room. Sarah Donovan, 38, a former logistics manager at Michigan Chemical Solutions, could barely hold back the tears as she recognized her former boss. "My daughter Emma was born with breathing problems," Sarah revealed, taking a seat next to Rebecca. "I worked for the company throughout her pregnancy, always near the product warehouse. The doctors were never able to fully explain the reason for her complications." Sarah's revelation opened up a terrible new dimension to the case. Dr. Patricia Whalen quickly organized a specific team to investigate the possible effects of chemical exposure on pregnant women and their children. The hospital made an entire ward available to examine children who might have been indirectly affected. Miranda, who now coordinated a victim support group, brought to light even more disturbing documents found in James' office. He was investigating similar cases in other companies in the sector, she explained during an emergency meeting with the legal team. Apparently, the suppliers of the chemical components have a history of problems all over the country. The investigation expanded beyond Michigan's borders. Gregory Palmer established contact with law firms in other states, discovering similar patterns of contamination in companies that used the same suppliers. The case was turning into one of the biggest public health scandals of the decade. Rebecca spent her mornings on days when she felt strong enough, helping other victims navigate the complex process of medical and legal documentation. Her experience as a former business owner provided valuable insights into where to look for evidence of exposure. "Every person we help," she shared during a support group session, "is a small victory for James. It's as if somehow we're finally answering those calls he made." The case attracted the attention of Lauren Matthews, a Michigan state senator known for her work on environmental regulations. After a meeting with Rebecca and the legal team, Matthews promised to take the case to the state Senate, pushing for significant changes in industrial chemical safety legislation. "What happened at Michigan Chemical Solutions cannot be seen as an isolated case," Matthews said at a press conference. "It is a symptom of a systemic problem in our chemical industry." While the legal battle raged, Rebecca faced her own personal struggles. The treatments were exhausting, and each new day brought the discovery of some new effect of the contamination on her body. Dr. Whalen had been honest about the prognosis. Some damage would be permanent. One particularly difficult afternoon, after a physiotherapy session, to help with the tremors, Rebecca found an old box in her closet. Inside were photographs from the early years of Michigan Chemical Solutions, she and James Young, and smiling, inaugurating the company that would be both their dream and their nightmare. "We were so naive," she murmured to Miranda, who was helping her organize the documents. "We thought we were building something important, something good." The investigation team's most recent discovery revealed that the problems with the chemicals dated back even further than they initially suspected. Quality test records from 2008 already showed anomalies that had been deliberately ignored by the suppliers. James must have felt so alone, Rebecca reflected during a session with her therapist, Dr. Rachel Foster. Discovering something like this, trying to alert everyone and nobody believing him. Or worse, not even listening. The weight of this realization led her to an important decision. With Palmer's help, Rebecca began organizing a medical aid fund, using her share of James' life insurance and her personal savings. The aim was to ensure that even victims who couldn't participate in the lawsuit would have access to adequate treatment. "It's the least I can do," she explained during a meeting of the fund's board. "I can't change the past, but I can try to make a difference now." As fall in Ann Arbor gave way to winter, Rebecca watched the trees shed their leaves through the hospital window during her treatment sessions. It was impossible not to see a metaphor in how the truth, like the leaves, eventually found its way to the ground, no matter how many barriers were put in its way. The Michigan Chemical Solutions case was far from over, but each new day brought small victories. One more victim identified, one more treatment started, one more life that could be saved, because finally someone was listening. And in each of these victories, Rebecca felt a little of the redemption. She so desperately sought, a distant echo of James' voice that she had refused to hear when there was still time. The preliminary hearing in the case of Michigan Chemical Solutions versus Allied Chemical Suppliers was scheduled for a chilly January morning in Detroit federal court. Rebecca Harrison watched her own image reflected in the cab window as they drove through the snow-covered city. The months of treatment had left visible marks. Her once vibrant brown hair now displayed premature gray streaks, and deep lines marked her still youthful face. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" asked Miranda, sitting down next to her. The concern in her voice was palpable. Rebecca adjusted the scarf that hid the stains on her neck, one of the many visible reminders of chemical exposure. "I have no choice. James can't tell this story anymore. I need to be his voice now." The case had become one of the biggest public health scandals in the Midwest. The investigation revealed that Allied Chemical Suppliers had deliberately falsified safety data for dozens of companies in addition to Michigan Chemical Solutions. Rebecca discovered that her personal story was just the tip of a much deeper and darker iceberg. Inside the courtroom, Judge Marcus Henderson was presiding over the session with a grave expression. The room was packed, lawyers, journalists, and dozens of victims, each carrying their own story of pain and betrayal. Gregory Palmer had prepared a meticulous presentation, starting with James' original records. "Your Honor," Palmer began, his voice echoing in the silent room, "what we have here is not just a case of corporate negligence. It's a systematic conspiracy to conceal information that has cost lives and continues to threaten thousands of people." Rebecca observed the Allied Chemical Suppliers executives lined up in their expensive suits, their expressions carefully neutral. Among them was Richard Blackwell, the company's CEO, whose internal emails revealed a detailed knowledge of the risks of the products they sold. Dr. Patricia Whalen was the first expert to testify, presenting alarming data on the increase in cases of neurological and respiratory diseases in areas near factories that used Allied's products. "We're just beginning to understand the full extent of the damage," she explained, projecting graphs that showed a frightening correlation. During the break, Rebecca met Emma Donovan, Sarah's daughter, in the corridor of the courthouse. The 7-year-old, dependent on a portable oxygen tank, was holding a drawing. She had made a colorful portrait of James based on a photo she had seen in the newspaper. "Mummy said he tried to help everyone," said Emma, holding out the drawing to Rebecca. "He was a hero, wasn't he?" The girl's words hit Rebecca like a punch in the gut. She thought of all the times she had called James manipulative, paranoid, obsessive. The truth was that his obsession had been motivated by a desperate race against time to save lives. When the session resumed, Rebecca was called to testify. With careful steps, she made her way to the witness stand, aware of the tremors that intensified under stress. Palmer had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could really prepare her for reliving her story publicly. Ms. Harrison, Palmer began. Could you describe for the court when you first began to notice symptoms? Rebecca took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Miranda's in the audience. The symptoms started subtly: joint pain, fatigue, a cough that wouldn't go away. But I was so determined to move on after the divorce that I ignored all the signs. I ignored James. Her voice faltered momentarily. In the silence that followed, she could hear the soft sizzle of Emma's oxygen tank. James discovered the truth and tried to warn me in every possible way. He made dozens of calls, sent emails, letters, and I blocked every attempt to contact him. My anger and hurt blinded me to what really mattered. Allied's lawyer Martin Reeves tried to discredit Rebecca's testimony, suggesting that her medical conditions could have other causes. But James' meticulous records, combined with the new cases that emerged daily, formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. As the hearing drew to a close, Rebecca noticed something surprising. Richard Blackwell seemed genuinely upset. Miranda would later discover that his granddaughter had been born with breathing problems similar to Emma's. Her family lived near one of the factories that used Allied's products. Judge Henderson announced that he would need time to review all the evidence before deciding whether to proceed with the case. But his final words made it clear that the magnitude of the case had not gone unnoticed. What we see here today transcends issues of corporate responsibility. We are talking about human lives, about families destroyed, about a legacy of pain that can extend for generations. As she left the courthouse, Rebecca was approached by a group of former Michigan Chemical Solutions employees. Among them was Carl Whitaker, now using a cane for balance. "You did today what James would have done," said Carl, his voice breaking. "You gave us all a voice." That night, alone in her apartment, Rebecca reread James' last letter. The words, once clouded by anger and mistrust, now shone with painful clarity. Each sentence was a testimony of love and despair of a man fighting against time to save not only his ex-wife, but all those who had trusted him. The case against Allied chemical suppliers had only just begun, but something fundamental had changed. The truth, like a river dammed for too long, had finally found its way to the light. And Rebecca, even bearing the scars of her own resistance, was determined to ensure that James' sacrifice was not in vain. The Detroit Federal Court announced its final decision in the Michigan Chemical Solutions case on a March morning, exactly 1 year after James Crawford's death. Rebecca Harrison waited in the hallway of the courthouse, her hands clutching a small locket she had found among James' belongings, an old souvenir from when they opened the company together. The court recognizes the extensive corporate negligence on the part of Allied chemical suppliers, declared Judge Henderson, his voice resonating through the crowded courtroom, and orders the creation of a compensation fund in the amount of $2.1 billion for lifelong medical treatment of the victims. A collective sigh went through the room. Rebecca felt Miranda squeeze her hand, while silent tears streamed down both their faces. The victory was bittersweet. No amount of money could bring James back or completely reverse the damage done to the victims. In the weeks that followed, the case sparked a revolution in the American chemical industry. The Michigan Senate, led by Senator Matthews, passed stricter legislation to control industrial chemicals, which became known as the Crawford Act, a tribute to the man who sacrificed everything to expose the truth. Rebecca turned her experience into a mission. With part of the compensation money, she established the Crawford Center for Chemical Safety Research, an institute dedicated to investigating and preventing similar cases. The center, located in a modernist building near the University of Michigan, has become a national reference in studies on occupational chemical exposure. "James always said that our company should make a difference in people's lives," Rebecca shared during the center's inauguration. "Not the way it happened, but now we can honor his memory by helping to prevent other families from going through the same thing." Dr. Patricia Whalen has taken over as head of the center's research department, coordinating longitudinal studies on the effects of chemical exposure. Emma Donovan, the little warrior who had touched so many hearts during the trial, became patient zero in a revolutionary study on regenerative lung treatments. The impact of the case spread like ripples on a pond. Other companies in the sector began to voluntarily audit their processes. Richard Blackwell, the former CEO of Allied, surprised everyone by becoming one of the main advocates of reform in the chemical industry, motivated by his granddaughter's condition. Sometimes we need to lose something precious to see what really matters, he declared at a conference on industrial safety where Rebecca was also a speaker. On a quiet fall afternoon, exactly 18 months after James' death, Rebecca visited his grave. The soft Michigan wind stirred the leaves on the trees, creating dancing shadows on the headstone, where it now read, "James Crawford's search for the truth saved countless lives." "You were right all along," she murmured, laying a bouquet of lilies, his favorite flowers. "And now your legacy is changing the world." Miranda, who accompanied her, observed how Rebecca had changed. The tremors were still there, as were the spots on her skin, but there was a new strength in her eyes, a determination that transcended physical suffering. The victim support group continued to grow, now occupying an entire floor of the Crawford Center. People from all over the country sought help and guidance, finding not only medical treatment, but also a community that understood their pain. Carl Whitaker, using his experience as a former production supervisor, became a valuable consultant, helping other companies to identify and correct potential risks in their production processes. His cane, once a symbol of frailty, became a trademark of his lectures on industrial safety. "Every life we save," he used to say, "is a tribute to James." The work was far from over. New cases were still emerging as more people connected their health problems to past chemical exposure. But now there was hope, and more importantly, there was action. Rebecca began writing a book about her experience, not just as a historical record, but as a warning to future generations. The words flowed like a dammed river finally finding its way to the sea. Silence can be our worst enemy. Sometimes the truth comes in forms we don't want to recognize, brought to us by voices we choose to ignore. James tried to reach me through the walls I had built with my own hurt. His persistence, which I mistook for obsession, was actually love in its purest and most desperate form. The Crawford Center has become a symbol of transformation, not just from tragedy to hope, but of how love can transcend death and create something meaningful out of pain. On the walls of the main lobby, a gallery of photos told the story James and Rebecca Young, and smiling at the opening of Michigan Chemical Solutions newspaper clippings about the case faces of people whose lives were saved by the work of the center. On a particularly challenging morning, when the symptoms seemed to be at their most intense, Rebecca found one last letter from James that had been left forgotten in an old folder. The words, written in the shaky handwriting of his last days, seemed more relevant than ever. "Dear Beck, if you are reading this, it means that I failed to reach you in time. But perhaps somehow this truth will find its way to you. Don't carry guilt, carry purpose. Turn our story into something bigger than ourselves. This has always been our dream, hasn't it, to make a difference? Now you have that chance. All my love, James." Rebecca folded the letter carefully, keeping it next to the locket. Through the window of her office at the Crawford Center, she could see people arriving for another day's work, researchers, doctors, patients, all part of a legacy that was born of pain but blossomed into hope. The truth had found its way, even if it was too late for James. But his sacrifice had become a beacon of change, lighting the way to a future where other voices wouldn't have to be silenced, where other lives wouldn't have to be lost for the truth to come out. That, after all, was the true price of redemption, not just recognizing the mistakes of the past, but turning them into the foundation for a better future. And in that respect, James Crawford's legacy was still as alive as ever, echoing through the lives he helped save and the changes his sacrifice inspired.